Next, so we have a bit of code repetition here. So we have the code that sets the interval. It's basically the same as the one that we have in component did mount. We also have clear interval, and this is basically repeated in component will and mount. I'm going to change that. I'm going to create two separate methods. Let's call one pause, and let's call the other one resume. Okay. So when you pause, you basically want to clear the interval. We're going to do exactly that. Okay. We're going to basically clear the interval passing the interval property, and instead of doing the clear interval inside of handle pause toggle, I'm just going to call the pause method on this, and this block of code that basically creates an interval, that's going to be put in resume in the resume function. So similarly, we're going to call that method to avoid repetition. And of course, now that we have these two methods, we also don't need to call clear interval from component will and mount. We're actually going to call this pause. Okay. The same thing goes for component did mount. We're actually going to call this dot resume. Okay. And let's see if this actually works. So we're going to click on pause, and that's going to stop the timer. Resume, that's going to resume. And if you update the page, you can see that because by default pause is false, the timer is active and it basically goes down. So just a bit of refactoring in there for you. Let's remove the comment for now because we don't need it. Let's also move the label, or basically the text that refers to the number, below it, so that it's going to look something like this. The number is actually going to be on the top and the label is going to be at the bottom. So I'm just going to remove that. It has nothing to do with the app. It doesn't really affect the functionality in any way, shape, or form, but basically I think it just looks a little bit better, so I'm just going to do that. Let's put it below, and for seconds I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I'm just going to put it down there, save. This is what it looks like. Another smaller refactoring thing I'd like to do is, if you go back to app.js, let's also remove the div, the wrapping div. It's essentially pretty much useless here because it doesn't do anything. And in the app component, we basically are just going to return the countdown itself, okay? So we don't need to wrap it in anything, and this is still going to work, of course. And while we're at it, let's also move the expressions to a separate line, just for better readability. So I'm going to just move them on a separate line like so. Let's do the same for the title. And also seconds, okay? This is not going to affect the app in any way again, but it's just for readability. So we're in a good shape right now. We have a countdown component. This is a stateful component. It basically contains all of the state. And then it also has a dependent controls component that relates to that countdown. Now you can see that the controls are really not that reusable. So the controls themselves, they only relate to the countdown timer component. And in fact, you can't really reuse them anywhere else because they only make sense within the context of the countdown. So I'd like to refactor this a little bit further. Let's create a folder. Let's go with countdown, okay? And let's move the two components in there, okay? So we're gonna have a separate folder that represents the countdown timer. And I'm going to create a new file, and I'm gonna call it index.js, okay? Back in app.js, we are going to have our countdown be moved to index.js instead of countdown.js. I'm going to rename the import. It's going to go to countdown. And the reason I created an index.js file is because, first of all, this component, app.js, is going to look for countdown.js. It's not going to find the file, but it's going to find the folder countdown. It's going to go inside of that folder. And because we have index.js, it's basically going to go to that file by default. So we don't need to do /index or index.js even, right? We could just leave it off. It's going to go to index by default. We don't need to do anything else other than that. Now in index, let's basically have all of the countdown markup inside of index.js. And then in countdown, we're basically going to have just the timer, but the index itself is going to contain all the state, okay? So let's do the following. Let's do import React from React. Okay, the very first thing we always need to do. Let's also import countdown from countdown. On this note, I will probably rename countdown to just timer, right? Because this is what it's going to be. It's just going to be a timer. And the countdown is actually index.js. This is what the component is going to be. So I'm going to call it timer. Okay. We're also going to need controls, right? The buttons. controls from controls. Let's create a new class. We're going to call it countdown. It's going to extend the component, which we also need to import along with React. Let's do component from React. This is going to be a class extends with an S, don't forget that. And let's also do export default. Let's save that. Now in timer, this is no longer going to be countdown, this is going to be timer. Okay, and we're basically going to move most of this markup to index.js. Okay, so what I will actually keep inside of here is only the level, I think. So I'm going to remove everything from the top to index.js, and we're going to have a render method. Okay, this is going to return that block. And then we'll also, let's see, we have a section here. This is the closing div for the level. I'm going to move this stuff to index. Okay. And then in here, I will basically put our timer. I'll close it off. And this is going to be adjusted. In fact, this is going to go to that line. This looks good. Now the other thing I think I'll do is I remove the constructor from here. So I'd like to keep all of the state inside of the countdown component. That state is basically going to be passed to the timer, okay? And I'm going to move all of these methods and I'll just basically drop them in here in index.js. I'll save that. And of course the timer now, the timer is going to expect duration as well as pause. This component no longer needs to be stateful, so I'm going to make it functional. Let's create a constant called timer. It's going to be an arrow function that accepts properties, props, and it's going to return this block of code. So it's basically going to return the level that is going to contain basically all the output that needs to be displayed or rendered, right? Let's also adjust it just a little bit. I'm going to remove the render method. Okay, we don't need any of this stuff anymore because we no longer have the class. Let's remove that, and finally this I'll bring to the same line. You might have seen a little bit of a different syntax where you have parentheses. So you could wrap the div with parentheses. It still works without the parentheses in most cases, but you just got to be careful with semicolons, and specifically automatic semicolon insertion. It's a little bit off topic, so I'll just leave it off for now. But here we are going to need the duration object. Back in index.js, when we call the timer, we need to pass duration, okay? And the duration is basically going to be this dot state dot duration. In fact, let's do the following. We're going to need to bring back the constants here, right? So let's do constant. I'm going to use the structuring again. Let's do duration, and let's also do pause. Pause is needed for the buttons, right? So I will just assign all that stuff to the state, like so. It's basically going to extract those two variables from the state. I'll pass the duration in there, and I think this should work by now. Let's go back. Okay, module not found, can't resolve, blah blah blah. Let's see, what's the issue here? In app.js, I can't find countdown. Oh, I think I misspelled it. Sorry guys, countdown. It's not two D's, it's only one. Now it complains that moment is not defined. Of course, back in timer, we need to move moment now to index.js. Okay, so let's put it in here, moment.js. I think that should be fine. Anything else we're missing? Export default. Timer was not found in timer. Aha, I forgot to export the constant. So let's do export default timer. Let's remove that space, and it should be fine by now. Yep. Except component is defined but never used. Aha, I know what that is. So we don't need the component here because we have a functional, not a stateful component. Okay, like so. Controls is defined but never used. And that's interesting. Let's see. How come the controls are never used? Oh, okay. We don't need controls inside of timer anymore. Okay, so I'm just going to remove those. And this is basically it. I think it should be perfectly functional. Let's click on pause. That pauses the timer. Click on resume. That resumes the timer. Okay, so this is pretty good so far. So I think this was a good refactoring. And of course, you could argue whether the timer needs to have state whether it needs to maintain its own state, checking what the duration object needs to be, calculating the difference between the two dates. And I would probably say that you're right. It should probably be the responsibility of the timer to calculate those two dates. But at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it off like that, and I'm going to keep all of the state inside of index.js. And like I said, it's useful to have the state be inside of index.js because first of all, the timer is going to be functional. It's going to render a little bit faster. So that's a plus. The buttons or the controls are also functional. That's also a plus. And all of our state is now centralized inside of index.js. It's just easier to manage it. And whenever we need to pass it, it's basically going to be passed as properties to the functional components that actually need it. Lastly, the one thing we could also do is we could also use the ES7 class property syntax like I showed you for the methods. So here we use it just so that we have access to the this keyword. Because if you watch the ES6 series, I explained in the video about arrow functions that the arrow functions, unlike traditional functions, like when you use the function keyword, the arrow functions actually allow you to preserve the this keyword. So the context of the this keyword gets saved or gets preserved, unlike normal functions. Because if you have a traditional function, you try to access this keyword. If it's a method on an object, it's going to refer to that object. But sometimes it might actually refer to the window object. Or if it's a strict mode, it might actually refer to undefined. So the value might be undefined. This is not the case with arrow functions. With arrow functions, this keyword gets preserved so that we have access to the outlining object that basically invoked the function. In this case, this object is going to be the component itself. So this was just a bit of a side note. My point is, we could actually use the same syntax for the state. And instead of doing this state, instead of the constructor, we could actually move that outside. So what I'm talking about here is, let's set a state property. We're basically going to set it to the same object as we have in here, right? And I'm going to remove the constructor. So this removes quite a bit of code for us, but it simplifies things also. So now we just have the state property. It's going to have duration and it's going to have the pause property. And behind the scenes, it's actually going to invoke the constructor for us. So we don't have to write the extra code to do that. And calling, the super keyword and all that stuff. We just set the property like this with the ES7 syntax. And I think it should still work, right? We pause it, stops, resume, continues. Perfect. So I think I'm going to stop here. In the next video, what we're going to do is I think I'm going to add a new input box. It's going to be a Datepicker, and this is basically going to allow us to explore how forms work in React and how you could actually bind events to inputs and how you can listen to events on inputs. So a lot of cool stuff. I hope you stick around, and I'll see you next time.